may I present Mr. Rob Kleiner.
Yay!
I'm from Chicago, Illinois, and I moved to Los Angeles 10 years ago to pursue music. I was doing it in Chicago, but it was a lot easier after I moved here because it's a really good place to network in Los Angeles and meet, people, and get on different projects. And I've got a recording studio inside my place, which is right next door to Steve's place. Literally, just a couple doors down. And yeah, I'm a workaholic. I probably work 10 hours a day, 7 days a week, because I really love what I do, and I wouldn't rather be doing anything else. And maybe sometimes that's bad because I should go outside every once in a while, but I'm pretty happy with my flow otherwise.
It's true. We live 2 doors away from each other, and because I'm a workaholic too, I mean, pandemic or not, we rarely see each other.
I see you outside the window, that's how I see you the most often, or like at the mailbox.
Yes, exactly. I met Rob, I think in 2005 or 6, around then. Had Firecracker already come out?
I think it just came out.
Okay, so it was around 2005 or 6.
Yeah.
And then my movie after that, I asked you to score. Had you scored a movie prior to that?
I think I had scored at least a couple shorts. It might have been the first full length, but it might have been, it was either the first or the second full length, and before that it was just shorts and like commercials, I think. Really short things.
Had you always wanted to get into that aspect of music making?
I did. I thought you're talking about film scoring?
Yes.
Yeah, I always did. I love watching movies just as much as I like listening to music. So the idea of getting to do both kind of at the same time is like the coolest thing in the world.
Totally. Had you, I don't know, studied or were there film composers that you admired or that sort of inspired you from any movies that you'd seen that gave you the idea of oh, that'd be really cool to do someday?
Yeah, I think, when I was like fresh out of school, like my two heroes were like Danny Elfman and Ennio Morricone. And I really loved their film scores, and they were like, before that, I think if I had an album, it would be like a rock album or a hip hop album. But those were like the first scores that I wanted to like listen to. I wanted to go home and listen to the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly score, or Pee-wee's Big Adventure score. Those were like albums that I just wanted to listen to because they were so brilliant.
And honestly, it was around that same time, even though those that you're describing were a different style of sort of movie soundtrack in general. That was the highlight of you would go buy the soundtrack of the movie.
Yeah.
And the songs that were used in the movie, in addition to the score, became hits, a lot of them.
Yeah, that's true. There's a lot of big ones.
Yeah. What do you know the technical name for, let's say there's the score of a film.
Yeah.
But then there's a song that has been licensed by an artist that is appearing in the movie. What's that called?
Yeah, so there's I think that's the subtle difference between score and soundtrack. I work with a couple of labels that put out soundtracks now, and that's a lot of times on an actual soundtrack, they'll put both the score and what they in the film term call the soundtrack together on an album. But I think typically they'll call the licensed music the soundtrack and the score.
I see. What about the music that's playing in the diner on the radio in the background.
Right. Like background music or like incidental, that kind of thing. Or yeah, there's another name for it too. A lot of times that'll be included in the soundtrack. You know, they'll put that, they'll consider that part of the soundtrack for sure.
I don't know if you ever knew this, but I was approached at some point, probably 09, 10, or 11. I can't quite remember when. Oh, no, I know exactly when it was. It was before Casserole Club. There was a service called either Film Music Network or something like that. It sounded something like that. And it was a place where, as a filmmaker, you could post sort of a call for other musicians or bands or whomever, if you were looking for a style of music. And that movie was, you know, set in the 60s, and I really wanted some sort of doo-wop, authentic 60s sounding music.
Right.
So I put sort of like a call out there, and then I got like tons of submissions from other artists. And as a filmmaker, it's a good resource to find a way to connect with lots of different musicians and bands and people making work. But it's also a really good resource for songwriters, musicians to pay attention to and submit to lots of different projects.
Yeah.
To get their movie scene. Did you ever do anything sort of like that when you were sort of starting out years and years and years ago?
I didn't, but I surely would have. I think those type of platforms work best for the type of artist that has a catalog built up. You know what I mean? And like, what do I do with all this music? It's not necessarily like a super productive thing for somebody that's like starting, you know, or you know, just getting going with figuring out their style or things like that. Those are great, because I even remember one of the probably several of the songs you found. They were from like old timers in New Jersey that like had a song on a record label 30 years ago, and now they own the masters, but they didn't have anything to do with it, and they don't have an agent, and nobody's gonna take, you know, a bucket of songs from that sound like, you know, a very specific era and are not current. But hey, every once in a while, a filmmaker will come along and, oh, this is perfect for my movie. And I think those platforms are really good for that type of artist. You know what I mean? Somebody, like I said, that's got a catalog and needs something to do with it.
Totally. And I also don't know from the side of the musician if there is an expense to be a member of those pages and groups. I probably think there might be.
Yeah.
But as a filmmaker, you don't have to pay. So if anybody wants to, you know, have that resource, I could track it down. But if you just search, you know, Film Music Network, there might be another word or two that pop up, or there might even be another resource, another website, another company. There are lots of those types of sites where you can ask certain artists about licensing their songs, some of whom you can afford and some of whom you can't. It just depends on the artist. Rob, I can't remember if I ever told you this story, but Eric Sherman had a client once who was a filmmaker, and he wanted to get a Peter Gabriel song licensed for his film. And he only wanted like 35 seconds or something. Mm-hmm. And Peter's people came back and said, well, that'll be like $30,000. And the guy's like, oh, well, shit, I don't have that kind of money. Sorry. And then he asked around and was sort of hitting like no's everywhere, you know, or just outside his budget. And then he came across the group Alabama. And he asked them about one of their songs, and they're like, yeah, go ahead, use it. Like for nothing, right?
Wow.
Yeah, so in your experience, just working within the music business, have you seen a lot of variety of people who are on one end of the spectrum not willing to work for less than a lot of money, or on the other end where people are willing to work for not very much?
Well, in regards to licensing, it's probably less complicated than you think, but in kind of a complicated way. So, unfortunately, a lot of the artists don't. It's not up to them, right? So, when you're obtaining a license for a film, you have to get clearance from both the person who owns publishing, and the person who owns the recording. So typically, those two parties are a publisher and a record label. Sometimes the artist is both or one of those, are partial owners in one of those. But the problem is you got to get all parties to sign off on it, right? And one party might be like, hey, I could use beer money tomorrow night. Yeah, use it for $50. But another party is like this big corporation, and they're like, well, $50 split two ways. That doesn't even pay for our electricity for 1 second, like, so you could kind of, it's not as sinister or like as it might seem. Plus, then when you're talking about the Peter Gabriel thing, for example, you have to look at it at another perspective. Everything is, supply and demand. If they started licensing Peter Gabriel songs for $100 a film, then every film would just have Peter Gabriel songs all the time, and Peter Gabriel wouldn't be getting paid for it, neither would the publishers or the labels. So they kind of put a price tag on it, and that way they're, if they don't sell something to Joe for really cheap and then somebody else for really expensive, and it can decrease the value of what their catalog is worth by selling it too inexpensively to parties like that. So that's the short of it, or the long of it.
Cool. Well, and then there's also the thing that you sort of briefly mentioned, which is the artists themselves may not even actually own their own material.
Often not. Often they got a record label, or they got a publishing deal, and so they might not own any of it. They might own part of it. The nice thing about older catalogs, and probably the website you were talking about, a lot of times you get that stuff back after a certain amount of years. So in these websites where you're finding this cool old like 60s music to license, or 70s music, or 80s, probably even at this point 90s music, it's because those ownerships of masters and publishing reverts back to the artist after a certain amount of time in a lot of cases.
Are some of those deals, for instance, in the film world, when I license a movie for distribution, sometimes it's 10 years, sometimes it's 15 years, sometimes it's 20 years, but then after that period of time, I get my rights back.
Right.
And so in the music business, though, is there like a time limit that's pretty standard, or does it vary also?
It varies. But yeah, like 10, 12, 14 years are kind of common things you hear.
All right.
I know less about the master, the recording ownership than the publishing. I deal a lot more in publishing than master recording. So publishing typically reverts back after 10, 12, 14 years, something like that.
Cool. And then anybody who, I've heard over time, many times, musicians tell other musicians, never sell your publishing.
Yeah, well, that's...
What does that mean, first of all?
So, your publishing is basically like the royalties you get, and the money you get. Like if you license your song for, say, $1,000 for your film, that means the publisher gets half and the label gets half. So they would both take $500. So if you own the publishing and you get a song licensed in Steve's film, now you get $500. Let's say a publisher comes along and goes, hey, I'll take all your publishing for all the songs you write for the next 10 years, but I'll give you $1 million right now. Well, hey, $1 million sounds kind of great. I can go buy a house with that. Obviously that's a really nice publishing deal, but never sell your publishing deal. It depends for different people in different circumstances. You know what I'm saying? And if we're talking about film music specifically, like somebody that scores films probably isn't a big reason to get rid of any of your publishing if you're scoring films. Because most likely you're doing individual deals with filmmakers, for your music, and so like if somebody else has to like okay it, that's kind of a pain in the ass. So like I think a lot of composers don't really have publishing, so that's not really something like composers for film have to deal with too much. It's more like for pop songwriters.
Right. Okay. Um, what other kinds of, I don't know, sort of film, TV, commercials, projects that have you done that you've done in the years since working with me that were sort of like a really crazy, cool, weird, strange experience?
Wow. Aside from your movies, which were very, very fun to score, and I still listen to like Stuck in Casserole Club, but yeah, I don't know. I've done video games, I've done commercials, I've done like trailers, and I've done other like short films. These days, I do commercials a lot more. Just because that's kind of the world I've fallen into, and yeah, I don't know. They're all crazy and fun. It's like the thing about the commercials is usually the deadline's crazy tight. So like when with your movie, usually we had like a month, 6 weeks or something, or at least that was what we wanted to make some type of deadline for. But yeah, like I did an Audi commercial like a couple weeks ago, and it was like I had like 2 days to give them like 5 versions, totally different things. And although it's only 30 seconds long, I mean, 2 days is pretty short amount of time. You got to be like pretty efficient and on it, to do that. And yeah, and I've been mixing and mastering a lot of like soundtracks for movies too, which has been fun and crazy. I just mixed the soundtrack for this really awesome movie on Hulu called Shirley, which was like really, really cool. And that was exciting and fun. And yeah.
When you're working on such a short time frame where it's like you got to get this done in 2 days,
Yeah.
do you ever second guess what you're doing, or do you just go with whatever's coming out?
Man, like probably the same for a lot of artists. It's like when you got to get things done, like I kind of black out, right? And then I wake up a day later and it's done. And I kind of don't know how I did it, but it just gets done. I don't know. You just gotta like, you just gotta like, just you just gotta go and just kind of. I guess it's like focusing. It's just. But yeah, it's always scary. The scariest part is like step one. It's like the whole world's open. Like I could go in any direction I want, and that's always the scariest thing for me. But it's like once I put a foot down in one direction, then it usually just kind of like rolls. For me at least.
Cool.
Yeah.
What about? Well, actually, no. Let's go to like, what movie have you seen where the soundtrack or the score just was awful, but the movie could have been great?
Yeah.
It's just that really bad choice of music or something.
We just watched Shallow Grave the other night. It's Danny Boyle's first movie, who did Train Spotting and like Slumdog Millionaire and a bunch of things. And I hadn't seen it in like 15 years, but I remember really loving it. It's also Ewan McGregor's first movie and a bunch of people's first movie. Actually, there's only like 5 people in it, but and it had some cool licensed music, just like Train Spotting does, like these like 90s like drum and bass, like London, like I'm the gritty cool Londoner, and but then the score was awful. It was terrible. There's this like scene where they're driving into the woods at night, and it's like just sounded like awful, like MIDI crap. And now it's like a low budget movie, so I don't want to be too hard on it. And the movie itself is brilliant. But I think, a lot of times score can be one of those things that a filmmaker skimps on when they don't have a good budget. And at least I can always tell. I'm always like, it throws you out of it, when it doesn't like, it's not engaging and it sounds like a paint by numbers kind of thing. At least for me.
Well, and also if you were doing an indie film that long ago, it's like he probably didn't have, I mean, back then Pro Tools wasn't around. It was probably a really bad MIDI keyboard.
Yeah, that's probably true. Yeah, I read that the budget was $1 million. So, yeah, I mean, that's nothing basically for, I mean, it's shot beautifully and it's got like expensive sets and stuff like that. And yeah.
Did you ever see Robert Altman's Images?
I have watched 2 Robert Altman movies in the last 4 weeks, but neither of them were Images.
I recommend it because it's insane and psychotic, and you don't know whether what you're watching is really happening or not.
Cool.
But the choice of score was so grating sonically. Now, on one hand, the movie is also so it suits it, but it's so harsh. It's like this Japanese flute maybe, or some kind of a wind instrument that is just like bang, and then just like, you know, and like in your face, like in your ears, and not, there's no rhythm, there's no, it's very experimental, there's no like melody, there's no, it's just noise. And
maybe to just throw you off, like while you're watching it.
Could be, and you know, you are unsettled as you watch it, so perhaps that was the impact that you wanted. The other thing I was going to mention is sometimes great artists and great pieces of musical art are amazing, but may not belong in that particular movie. Once I was, and I didn't look too far into it, and you know, now that I know about licensing, I don't think I would have been able to do it anyway had I wanted it. But Mike Patton had given me his version of Begin the Begin, which I think is Gershwin. So I probably would never have gotten Gershwin to let me use it. You know, I would have never been able to afford that part of the license. But
yeah,
the song itself, which standalone was an incredible version of that song. There was no place for me to put it in my film Firecracker. And so I didn't use it, but the song itself was amazing. And I feel that, you know, there are some times where people, if they're in a situation like that, might say, oh, well, I have to put it in because this guy made it, this is amazing or whatever, and then find out later that it's not such a good idea, just from a creative standpoint.
Yeah.
When you've gotten away from more film scoring, and you've done a lot of sort of music producing and working with artists, and you've done vocal work for people and all this stuff. How is that a different type of experience than if you're, I mean, because the output for that is like a sonic creation that's a standalone sonic thing that has no visual element to it unless there's a video or artwork or things like that.
Yeah.
But how is the process for you different, going through different variations of the music world in comparison to the film world and the music involved with that, whether it's commercial or TV also?
Yeah, so like pop music versus like scoring or film stuff. Pop music has a lot more rules. You know, like the songs I write in pop, which is like probably 100 songs a year, they're all like less than 4 minutes long. They all have this, and this. If it's this style, it has this, it has this. There's kind of rules. I mean, obviously you break them sometimes, but there's kind of a roadmap, a very solid roadmap before you start, you know. And then with scoring, there is no rules. I mean, and there's no roadmap before you start. You can watch a film and sometimes, I know when we worked together, sometimes, you know, you would have scenes like, yes, music needs to be here, but does music need to go here or not? And, you know, like, you don't even know if there should be silence there or something. So you don't even necessarily know where to put all the music in a film, you know, on first watching it. And so I think there's pros and cons to both. Sometimes it's nice to have rules, Sometimes it's nice to have like at least an outline already sitting waiting for you before you dive into something. But then sometimes it's very freeing to have the whole world is your oyster. I think one of the things that makes me happiest being an artist is like a little bit of everything. You know what I mean? And just because I've been focusing on pop music over scoring, I like doing them both equally. It's just one of those things where you're making an art for a living. You gotta just go through the doors that are open at the moment, and hopefully the doors that are the biggest and the brightest. So that's the only reason that I kind of been focusing more on that.
Very cool. How do you know when to not put music into a scene?
Boy, hopefully you tell me. Yeah, I don't know. It's so funny because there's like some of my favorite movies will have like zero music in them. You know what I mean? And it's a choice, and it's a cool choice sometimes, or very minimal amount of music. And then some of them are like super, music the whole time, almost like a music video, a set of music videos. I think it all boils down to the tone of the film and what you want to like say with it, and whether the scenes can benefit from it or whether it steps on the toes of the scenes.
Have you learned any other sort of tip or trick or experience that you've had with scoring movies or TV or commercials that you wished filmmakers knew?
Well, I don't know if this is answering exactly what you're asking, but I guess the one thing that would be good if all filmmakers knew is just maybe like it helps to have some type of like knowledge of the language of music, because sometimes it can be very difficult to work with a filmmaker when they say like, yeah, the music is really good in the scene, but it needs to be more fuzzy and purple. And you as a songwriter are like, I don't know what you're talking about. Like, does that mean more drums and higher frequencies, or like, I think it's just helpful when I get that maybe not every filmmaker is necessarily like versed on music terms, but even things that make more sense, can make sense, like this needs to feel more hopeful. Even I can take something from that. It always sucks where it's like you get notes from a filmmaker that is just none of these terms. I can't translate any of these, So I guess that helps for filmmakers to just kind of be able to articulate what they want in a good way.
Yeah, I've found that to be the case where some people say, I told you to make it really pretty. I'm like, well, okay, there's 1.5 million ways to do that. Right?
What you consider pretty isn't necessarily what they would consider pretty, so yeah.
Exactly. Was that person's note really including the word fuzzy?
I get crazy notes all the time. I was doing music for, it was like an ad, and they were like, we want a sound effect here that sounds like a swoosh of cards, like when you're dealing cards, and so I literally put that in there, and they get like, no. And I'm like, well, that's it. What do you mean? No. And sometimes it's insane.
Or they may not know what they want. I mean, a lot of times in the movie business, it could be this way. It's sort of like a lot of executives or the people who are funding a script or things like that aren't actually all that creative visually.
Yeah.
So it's hard for them to even imagine in their minds to paint a picture of what it might be. And so they don't really know what it is they think they want until they see it.
Yeah. Yeah, the communication can be a tricky thing sometimes.
Yeah, for sure. We're about 15-20 from being at the end, and I wanted to slowly start opening it up for a Q&A from all of us involved, whether you have questions for Rob about music or music and film. I would like to try to stay within the relationship to film, TV commercials, instead of veering off totally into the music world. Just because all of our people that will see this are have film interests or interests in film. But welcome anybody to pop in anytime. Just click on and holler out, and we'll stop everything we're doing and talk to you for a second. Mm-hmm. Does anybody have anything right off the top of their heads?
I do. Steve, you said that there was a link or something called Film Music Network.
Yeah.
I think that might have been where I found you, or you found me.
Okay. That could be. I don't, whatever that is, that's the truth. But I don't remember the actual name. I would need to get on my desktop and hunt around a little bit for that.
Yeah, I'd be interested to know what that was exactly. If you could, you know, put it on LinkedIn or something like that, or shoot me an email or something. But you know. Okay.
Yeah, I will when I track it down. And if I find any others in the process too, I'll send those along too.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yes. Anybody else for the moment? No? Okay, we'll just keep talking. Mark, nothing to say? All right.
I'm thinking.
Okay, you think and
Allie's
got one.
Oh, okay.
What is the most obscure sound-alike that you've ever had to like either create as a musician or like find as a filmmaker? Like where it was like you just couldn't get rights to this sound, but it was just so weird and nobody was doing it. Because that's what I'm gonna do next. Just kidding.
Amazing. Well, I know that when I've sent projects to some people, I do put some temp music in, and you know, or I might say, hey, this is the feeling I'm going for, make it kind of sound like this. I don't know if I've ever had one that was so specific where I was like, you got to make it this song only fiddled with enough that it's in public so that it's not a copy.
Right.
I don't know, did we ever do that, Rob?
Yeah, there's a lot of that in film and TV. They can't get the rights to something, but they want to like maintain the feeling it gives you when you're watching it. And I do those, you know, a good amount of times. The first question I always ask is like, on a scale of 10 being like plagiaristic copy, almost exact, to 1 like gives you a vague similar emotion, like how close do you want this? And usually the person will say like 8 or 9. And I've come to learn that they actually mean they want 9 or 10. Like they want you to get as close to like a lawsuit as you possibly can. And it's always on the, I'm all blurry. It's always on the 8 or 9 side. It's always really high. They always want it really close. And it's, yeah, you know, it's a little weird sometimes. The weirdest thing is these days I get a lot of like references. Like I was doing a Maybelline commercial like a couple weeks ago.
You were in it?
No, and they said for temp music, and it like, you know, we want it to be like this. And it was temp music from a friend. The song was from a friend of mine, and she's like dirt poor. I'm like, why don't you buy the license from her? Why are you making me copy her? So, like, she'll sell it to you for like probably very cheap. Like, why are they like? I don't get to ask that, but I'm wondering like, why are they having me do this? Like, she's like just a working class, like small fry songwriter, and it was so weird to me. And like, so that's the weirdest thing I guess I've ever been asked to replace. And that's happened a few times now, and yeah, I like it.
That's very strange, especially when it's a corporation that has billions of dollars. I think, you know, I remembered one actually that we did, and I remembered it being a certain score, and I said, well, I kind of want it to be like this, but what I meant was just the rhythm. Like really not anything else about it. You know, just sort of like the tempo is what I mean. or kind of the way it sounded. So I guess then, therefore, it would have been more of like the emotional, visceral response to that sound.
Yeah.
Um,
That's cool. That's what it should be, you know. It should be more open like that, you know.
Yeah, for sure. There have been moments where there's been some, like in my current movie that we're in post on now, I was working with a composer on that, and she, all of the music was in public domain, and she was recreating it, you know, by herself, taking the Schubert by Liszt and then playing it herself, giving her own little spin on it, which I found interesting, that she added her own little like twist of the arrangement to make it her own, even though it's flat as day, the Schubert, right?
That's cool.
Yeah, have I shown you the movie yet? The final?
I don't think so. I don't think I saw the version I saw. I think is pretty like 6 months ago, maybe.
Okay, good. Well, I'm waiting for the color guide now, so this is boring for everybody else, but I'll let you see it as soon as I get it back. What is the rule? What are the rules about, like, how does Weird Al get away with it?
Legally, well, his stuff falls under parody law, so you're allowed to parody things. He actually doesn't even need to get permission from any of those artists. I'm not an expert on the legalities of this, but that's the short answer.
I see. Which I think is the same for most any art, if it's parody or used for educational purposes.
Yeah, and there's like it's an interesting. I wish I could sit down with a lawyer and like pick their brain about that one, because it is pretty interesting. There's a TV show called Nathan for You, and he turned like a few blocks from us, turned a store into like a Starbucks ripoff that used all their same logos, sold their same products, but he just put dumb next to the name, so it was Dumb Starbucks and like Dumb Latte and like Dumb REM CD, and he was saying, well, this is a parody law. And so people were like, wow, well, yeah, can you do that or can you not? I mean, it's obviously, he was doing it as a joke, but it was a thought-provoking kind of joke, you know? It was like, wow, yeah, that's a weird one.
I kind of like that.
Yeah. It's called Nathan for You. It's a really funny show.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Stephanie.
I have a question. So does this mean that if you find music that's about 100 years old and then you tweak it a little bit, it's kind of something that generally you can use?
Well, there is the public domain. So it varies, and it's changed. It most recently has changed in the last year or so, and I'm not sure what it is. You'd need to research it, but it used to be something like 70 years after the artist's death date, something like that. So if for instance, the books written by oh my God, I'm blanking on his name. L. Frank Baum wrote The Wizard of Oz, and there were 12 or 15 books. And a number of years ago, I don't know how many years ago, 5 or 10, 15, or whatever it was 70 years from his death date. So all of those books in The Wizard of Oz became public domain. So if you wanted to go make your own version of The Wizard of Oz based on the novel, not based on the art direction in the film or based on the score of that film, the MGM creation of that book is not public domain, but the book and everything in the book and the sketches in the book are public domain.
In regards to music, because they've been scoring music and making music for hundreds of years, is that about the same thing?
Well, I would think it would depend. I would think if Rob scores music for my film, and then my film, well, it depends. If I've just licensed the sync and master use rights, then I don't own that music. Rob still owns that music.
So what you run into, like, in a lot of cases, I guess to answer your question, like, yeah, it is the public domain in a lot of cases, something that old. The tricky thing is if you want to take something that's out there and put it in your movie, sometimes like a Beethoven song could have been recorded last year by the London Philharmonic, right? They actually own that recording. They don't, so you can't take that recording and put it into your film. But if you wanted to like do your own version of it or something like that, then you could do it. So every song probably has its own answer to that question. You know what I mean? It always depends on how you want to use it. Like if you're wanting to use just the song or you're wanting to use a recording, and then yeah, how old, and like if it's past a certain amount, like what Steve's saying, it's past, like it's gone into public domain. And I'm definitely not an expert at any of that stuff, but you can kind of, you know, do research on the particular song and recording a lot of times.
That's interesting. That puts a lot of people's works from 70 years ago just into play. I mean, concerning music.
Yes, and that's exciting also. But again, it changed over the past couple. It's either now 100 years. Like they've changed the length of year. I don't know what it is now, but it's different today than it was. The other thing that's really cool about it is, here's another example. So let's say you wanted the London Philharmonic version of Beethoven, and you couldn't afford to license it from the London Philharmonic. I discovered in the post on my current movie to go to other orchestras in other countries. So I don't remember which one it was where we found, it was like the Romanian orchestra or symphony or the Eastern, I don't know who they were, I don't remember. But it was a license from that orchestra that I could afford. But it's the same song, and it's still played by a symphony.
And you would think that there would be an electronic device that would take some playing of that, some rendition of that from 70 years ago, and you kind of just funnel it through that, and it tweaks it a little bit and changes that sound. And
well, kind of. I mean, if you're working with a skilled composer, a musician, you know, a person who's really into that language, there are digital means to make something, you know, there are physical live recordings of a violin, right, that you can pair with other live recorded instruments to create the sound of what would be the symphony. But there is a difference. Tell me if there isn't, Rob, but there is a huge difference between the recording of a live symphony and even trying to compose using live tracks.
You can fake it with like real sounds. I'm not 100% sure I'm understanding exactly what you're after, Stephanie. Like what specifically are you looking to do? I'm wondering.
You know, I'm not looking to do anything right now, but the thought was, you know how you have to change something enough so that it's not, you know, it doesn't fall within that purview of you're using somebody else's work. And so my question was, when we have, you know, we've got things like Siri, but I assume we're going to come up with other devices where this machine hears a song, you put it through, and it kind of changes it. Just like if you film a scene with people and you can automatically turn it into a cartoon, really, that kind of transition.
Like some type of a filter or something that changes
it.
Yeah,
it's a filter, and does that exist, and does that allow somebody to then use that secondary product
license free? Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one, you know, like I guess it's like, is it recognizable? That's okay. Like what a lawyer would ask, you know, or somebody would go in court. Like I know, like in the movie Inception, they took Edith Piaf's song and like slowed it down to like 1/100th of its speed, and that was part of the soundtrack. Now, had they not told anybody they did that, they probably would have got away with it, you know, because it's like, I mean, all totally unrecognizable. And even if some like internet nerd sped it up and discovered, hey, this is this Edith Piaf song that's like slowed down, I don't know that they would even have legal grounds to like come after them for that, because it's sort of like the laws with sampling people's music. There's drum beats that were sampled from like James Brown that you'll hear all the time on pop radio. It's like you're taking something and manipulating it in a new way, and in that regard, making something new out of it, truly unique, you know, truly new. And so a lot of times, yes, you can do that kind of thing, I think, without... I'm not an expert, a legal expert by any means, but I know of things in that world, yes, where I think you could do things like that, you know, without having to worry about it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question for Rob, unless anybody else has one meanwhile. Okay.
I thought of a question.
Oh, good.
Yeah. But I thought it was really interesting when you were talking about deciding whether or not music should be in a scene or not. And so it definitely like kind of sparked me thinking that this is a question for both of you, definitely. Is like, I always figured that the director really had the you know, the vision for that, you know, and I know it's probably different in every single film, but for you, Steve, like, do you, when you're having something scored, like how much guidance do you give in terms of like when you want music and when you don't, especially that?
I use the temp tracks where I want it. And then if there's a scene that I didn't use a temp track and the composer says, oh, I think you should really have music here and listen to this and see what you think, I typically use it. There has also been cases where I had temp music, like in the movie that's in post now, I had temp music in this one moment, and she said, I really don't think you should have music in this scene. And she explained to me why. And she was like, I think we just need a breather right now. And I'm like, oh, okay, I think you're right. And then I tried, you know, I just went through it without, and I was like, all right. And then I went with that. Because again, it's like my strengths are primarily visual, secondary auditory. So, and third kinesthetic. So it's like my auditory is fairly strong, but it's not as strong as my visual. So I will always default to the person whose auditory is more advanced than mine. But that's what I have to say about that. Rob?
Yeah, you know, I've worked with directors that have like very specific ideas for specific things, and then ones that are very like open, like, well, you know, they'll tell a composer like, what do you think? Or maybe, you know, a little bit of both too. You know, it's like, you know, it's probably the same for us as music producers. Is like, how collaborative do you want to be on this or not? You know, in some cases you have a very, very, very clear vision, and in other cases maybe you're too close to it and you need someone's ears on it that are not yours, and that's kind of the beauty of collaborating, you know?
Yeah. I mean, I imagine how different it is case by case, but I also would imagine like having to compose an entire film, like wanting as much information from the director as possible about that. Otherwise, like feeling like a guessing game, and probably your relationship with that director, how much you've worked with.
I did a short movie, and by short I mean like half hour, and it was one of the early ones I did, where the director said I had done a couple things for him, and he goes, I trust you completely, just do it. And at the time I thought, oh, that's awesome. So I spent, you know, weeks, and I did it, and I gave it to him, and he's like, no, can't use it. And that was when I learned that lesson, like what you just said. Yes, like as much, like if you've got ideas, do not hide them and do not put them on me to like guess what you want. If you don't have any ideas, that's fine too. But it's like I never made that mistake again. Like that was awful.
Although I will say that every time we work together, Mr. Kleiner, every time you send me something, there's no such thing as notes. it's
no from you.
It's always perfect.
Thanks, man. I asked, you know, because we have a great synergy when we work, and then I've worked with others that have been more, you know, contentious, and I've talked to other bigger like film composers than me since moving to LA, and I ask them about this too. Like I'm like, do you get like a lot of notes? You know, like I was talking to man, who's that one really famous guy? He's like the
Philip Glass?
like he did like I think he did Watchmen. Tyler Bates, is that his name? Anyway, I asked him, you know, yeah, Tyler Bates. He's done a lot of things. I think he won the Grammy for best score for the Facebook movie. Anyways, I asked him. I'm like, yeah, do you end up getting a lot of notes? Like, how does that work? Like to be, and he's a famous dude, you know. So he's like, people don't give me fucking notes, and I wouldn't take notes. And I'm like, yeah, I love it.
That's amazing. Well, yeah, I think that there's at some point where you're paying for the talent.
Yeah.
And you risk it sometimes, maybe.
I think it's cool to, like, you know, I'm sure he was half joking, like obviously he would take a note, you know, but I think, yeah, like you want to work in a perfect world, you want to work with somebody that you trust and you respect their ear, and it's you like giving up a little bit of control. Again, that's not to say that the people don't give him pages and pages of notes to follow, you know what I mean? But obviously he's doing something right, and he's like checking off boxes for the people he gets hired for, because he keeps getting hired, and he's won, you know, all these awards, and now he's a big, you know, famous dude, and so yeah, I mean, that's you know.
Well, and I would think that even if you'd won the Oscar and you'd won the Grammy and you'd won the whatever, that if you're working for a studio or production company, those executives aren't likely to just say, oh yeah, go ahead, go on and bring it back when you're done.
Yeah.
You know, unless, well, even if it's Martin Scorsese, I mean, even if you're at the top of your game, there are still people in the office or in, you know, back there next to where the checks are coming from, that will have some kind of input into the process, and likely would happen before he ever actually sat down to compose it.
True, yeah. That's true.
Okay, my question for you is, what's your favorite film musical?
Film musical. You're talking like a musical.
Like a music, like where they sing in there.
What if they sing for just like one part of the movie? Does that count, or does it have to be a whole musical? I've wondered that, actually.
Oh, you know, you mean like the Johnny Cash movie?
Well, like there's certain movies that like the characters inexplicably break into song for 10 minutes, but that's the only thing. That's the only time they do it. Anyways, I'll answer the question the way I think you meant to ask it. Probably my two favorite are Cry Baby and Pennies from Heaven.
Okay, cool. But you know what? I think that the movie where, what was it? What was the Johnny Cash one with Joaquin and, was it Reese Witherspoon?
Yeah. Is that considered a musical? I kind of make a difference in my mind of like musical and like music, like movie, you know, like I wouldn't consider that a musical, but maybe I'm wrong.
I don't think I would consider it a musical either, nor would I consider it a musical like, what was the one, Diana Ross? Huh?
Those are like biopics almost, you know, showcasing the music of different people. I would put them in a different category. But in that case, I mean, I thought the Queen one was really fun. I have a like soft spot in my heart for the Doors movie with Val Kilmer. I think that's like one of the coolest music movies of all time.
Did Oliver Stone do that?
I think so. People are shaking their heads that know more.
Okay.
So I'll trust you.
Cool.
Right.
Did everybody see Diana Ross playing Billie Holiday?
I haven't seen it.
I can't remember the name of it, but it is one of the most breathtaking performances by an actress of all time.
Wow.
And she did not win the Oscar. She was snubbed. And then the next year was in the movie that they gave her the Oscar for. It was sort of like, oh my God, we should have given it to her because we didn't realize how good it was. And so I guess we'll just give it to her this year. But I can't remember the name of it, but I highly recommend it. It's unbelievable. She's unrecognizable and it's phenomenal. And she, as Billie Holiday, is more Billie Holiday than Billie Holiday. It's unbelievable.
Lady Sings the Blues.
Yes. Yes. Thank you.
Yeah.
Have you seen it or did you just look it up? Ah, great. Cool. Okay, so we're right at an hour. Does anybody have any final questions for Rob before we say goodbye and go along our weekend? All right, everybody. Well, thank you for joining. I will put this on stevebalderson.com/resources after I've downloaded it and all that shit. But we will see you soon.
Yay.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Great to see everybody. Thank you very much.